Welcome to this digital ethno-narrative research for FSoS 3102, Family Systems and Diversity course. For our project, we interviewed an individual who identifies as Filipino. Before we show you our interview, let's go over some background information on Filipino culture, specifically relating to family relationships and dynamics. The average size of the immediate Filipino family is about 5 family members. It is also common to find 3 generations of the family living together. The nuclear family is a core family unit, though bonds are also often tight-knit among extended family members. Familial relationships also go beyond blood relationships, including distant relatives, close neighbors, or friends. Elders are greatly respected in the Filipino family dynamic. In Filipino culture, dating often comes in stages, beginning with courtship. Individuals have a significant amount of freedom in terms of choosing a partner to marry, though it is expected for the prospective partner to gain approval from their potential in-laws. The average age for marriage is 25 years of age for the bride and 28 for the groom. Cross-cultural families and domestic interracial marriages are often common for Filipino Americans. Filipino parents consider it their duty to provide the material and educational needs of their children. Looking at the gender roles in Filipino culture, men are brought up to take after their fathers and the elderly men in their lives, as women are raised to become less dominating and take after their mother and elderly women. The traditional roles of Filipino women are to work in gardens, care for the house, care for the children. On the other hand, Filipino men are in charge of cultivating the land and categorized into more dominating roles in society. We will now show you our interview with Montana, who has been so kind to show us their insight, view, and experiences of Filipino culture.
My name is Montana May Filoteo, and my last name, I'm pretty sure it means son of God, I think, because my dad's name's Theo, and it was like off of that like kind of theme, I guess. But my middle name is after my aunt, my Filipino aunt, and she was born in May, so that's her middle name also. Her name is Julia May. So Montana is just a random name that my parents liked.
I like it, it's cute.
I grew up in Rochester, Minnesota, so pretty close to here. And there was a big, I grew up with a big Filipino community. There was, lots of the extended, fictive kinship where you're not blood related, but, you have your family, you still call them your lola, lolo, tita, tito, sav. But it's a very rich town. And I felt a lot of class tensions and race tensions growing up, I would say. I went to the school, there's 3 public schools, and the school that I went to was more mixed income. There was one that was really poor and one that was really rich, and then ours, I felt like there was a lot more class tension, specifically between white people and people of color, students of color. So being in the honors program, where that's a lot of privilege, a lot of privileged white kids and others privileged kids in general, there'd be the people that I hung out with, which was mostly poor people of color that came from the same economic background as I did, and then all of my academic colleagues were super wealthy, and so that class dynamic I feel was a big thing. So my dad immigrated here when he was 11 and my aunt was 8. And the house that my grandparents live in, they lived in there was an upstairs apartment, and it was a 1-bedroom apartment. So my grandparents slept in the bedroom, my aunt slept in the living room, and my dad slept in the closet. He had a bedroom in the closet. And now that is the house that my grandparents own. They have a very weird story because it's very American dreamy, which is I'm happy that they succeeded, but also that's such a big fallacy. And so when I am sharing my story, then I'm yeah, they kind of did all these inspirational things, but that's obviously not the most common thing that happened. So being mixed, I feel you don't ever fit in one or the other because you're not full Filipino. They still see you as you're American Filipino. So it's not But then also, of course, you're not seen as white, you're not read as white or anything like that. And I feel like that was really ingrained in me because whenever I would say how I identified growing up, I'd be like, I'm half Filipino. Like the half was really, and now I'm just like, I'm Filipino. But let's see, my grandma, my Filipino grandma, we call her Lola, that's the word for grandma, and Lolo is the word for grandfather. She came from like a really poor rural family with 8 or 9 siblings. You know, they raise their own chickens and have a garden, and they're like work really hard because we're in poverty. And then one day her dad was like, you need to do science, that's what's going to give you money. And she's like, okay. And then she did that. Like she did that for the rest of her life. And so she never really questioned that. That was just her duty to her family to try to like bring them out of the poverty. So she did super well in school. She skipped a bunch of grades. She ended up graduating college by like 19. She's just like brilliant. And her career when she moved here, she was a neurobiologist at Mayo Clinic, like patenting medications. Like she was like inventing medication. So at our house we have all of her patents like all on the wall of like these
my gosh
stuff around like cancer or some like really big like research stuff. So it was very much like coming from nothing. And I'm like, damn, you're like really doing it, like you're doing it now. But that's not the reason why we came to the United States, because in the Philippines they were like, after she had, you know, gotten out of poverty and was like making more money, they lived a pretty comfortable life compared, and the class disparity is huge. Like obviously the amount of people that are living in the Philippines that are living in poverty is hugely disproportionate compared to a place in the global north. But my grandfather's family ran a like gambling house, like this underground illegal gambling house. And so a lot of the men that were in the family would play, and like his mother and his sisters would like serve these men that would play mahjong for like 4 days at a time, probably coked out, like nobody's business, like just doing tons of drugs.
Oh my gosh.
And that's how they made money. And so I think, and this is just something that happens to be my interest, I'm really into food anthropology, and I think food is like the best way to learn about another culture. And you can see that in the ways that like trade has influenced the history of the Philippines. You can see that in the food. You can see colonizers' influence on the food that they brought there. But then I feel like that's always my favorite part to talk about the Philippines, because, you know, Filipino food, people don't really know what that is. They're like, is it like Chinese food? It's like, well, not really. It's not East Asian, but there is Chinese influence from trade, because we got noodles from Chinese people. Like we would not have eaten, that's not something that was indigenous Filipino people were eating. And there's a lot of Spanish influence, because the Spanish colonized and occupied the Philippines for 333 years. So there's obviously a lot of that influence. They also stationed Mexican soldiers in the Philippines. So there's also, like, separate from that, Mexican influence on the cuisine. And then, I mean, we eat a lot of fish. It's an island nation. Goat and pigs and stuff that's easy to butcher there. But then also, because it's an island nation similar to like Hawaii, there's a lot of like preserved foods, like canned foods, like Spam and corned beef and all these things, because when you don't have enough space to do horticulture, then you need to like source your beef elsewhere, because pigs are easy enough to raise. But so the food is very interesting. It's a lot of tomatoes and onions and garlic and fish sauce and soy sauce. So it's like a lot of things that you wouldn't think would come together, but because of the history of the Philippines, it comes together. So I feel like growing up, that was like my biggest tie, because my family didn't teach me how to speak Tagalog when we were young, because my dad didn't really speak it anymore by the time that I was born. And they're like, well, we all speak English here, we don't really need to teach you that. So I feel like that's a big part of my cultural identity that I'm missing, because my family still speaks it in the home, so I'm like, you could have just taught it to me. I feel like a lot of the traditions are maybe similar to what you would see in like Catholic families in Latin America. I think it's 80% of Filipinos are like Roman Catholic, so a lot of those things, but they also look the way that Catholicism in Latin America looks, like the way that it was colonized by Spain, where the Catholicism is infused with indigenous practices. So there's still a lot of these beliefs of like spirituality and other stuff, but then also like the Catholic stuff. So in terms of traditions, we celebrate Christmas. It's not, there's a really long celebration like leading up to Christmas. We don't actually do this, but like Filipinos in the Philippines do this, where it's like an obscene amount of days. I want to say like at least 60 days leading up to Christmas. They're like, Christmas! So we're like really into Christmas. And New Year's Eve is, that's more so of the holiday where your extended family is giving, like they might not give you Christmas presents, but they give you New Year's Eve money. So that's like our holiday thing. But my family is Catholic. They don't practice a whole ton. My Lola says that she's more spiritual than religious, which, you know, a lot of Catholicism is more of the ritualistic, like the performance of religion, but she's more spiritual, but that's just what she was raised in. It's an interesting phenomenon for most people who have like a family member who's an immigrant, because whatever you're learning from your culture, you're learning from them, because they're the last tie to the Philippines. So like I wasn't born in the Philippines, but my closest tie are my dad and my grandparents. So whatever they experienced when they were living in the Philippines is kind of like a snapshot in time, and that's the type of traditions that I learn about. So like my cousins in the Philippines who are a similar age, you know, their family members are a lot less strict. They seem more modern and less like traditional than my grandparents do, because they're bringing the culture from their generation. Like they haven't been in the Philippines where things are changing, and Philippines is super westernized, absolutely. So so I can see it kind of as a good and bad thing, where I'm glad that my family members in the Philippines get to feel more liberated about certain traditional expectations, but then at the same time, like, I know that a lot of those are super Western influenced. So being in America, I already have that, where it's just kind of a little bit outdated exposure to what Filipino culture is, a little more traditional. And then here, growing up, it was better because I had more people around me, but now that I live up here, I don't really have a Filipino community the way that I did before. So it can feel a lot more isolating. And even then, most of the people that I was growing up around were all like my grandparents' age, so like they weren't people that were my age really. But that community was still important. Like it was still important to have that representation. But now, yeah, I'd say it's really hard for me to try to find like in-person spaces for Filipino stuff. So I am on like online Filipino stuff. Like there's like places where queer and trans Filipino people get connected. So I like know people from like those kind of support groups. And I'm like, some of those people I feel like super close to, even though I've never met a lot of them. For a lot of old school Filipinos, and just like people in general, it's like totally acceptable to hate your kids. And I know like growing up, that was something that specifically me and my friends who are also children of immigrants would like, it's like laughing off that pain of like, okay, this was actually like physical abuse for many years. So it's like, oh, your mom hit you with a spoon, my dad hit me with a remote, I don't know. And so I think that is something that's a little bit different from like a more normative narrative, but also I feel like a lot of Americans in general like still hit their kids for punishment. So it's a balance, because it seems like I feel like there's a connotation of like people of color and immigrants being a lot more violent anyway. So, but that is one thing that I feel like wasn't healthy. That was also definitely like culturally influenced, because that's like a normal thing. Like, oh, that's just, if you're bad, you get hit. But I think something that was different about my household is that extended family is really important in Filipino culture. Like, in Filipino culture, if you're not married or you're not going to school or you're not moving off or doing something, there's no point in you moving out. So, and that was something that was hard for my family to grapple with, that I'm like, I'm telling them I'm up here struggling, like it's hard for me to find work, it's hard for me to pay my bills. They're like, why not just move back home? I'm like, well, that's like a part of American culture that I do like. I want my own individuality. I don't want to like I just don't want to stay in Rochester either. I'm like, no, I got other places to be and like stuff to do. But so I feel like a lot of people would imagine that an immigrant family is going to be like, oh, you shouldn't date or whatever. That never really was the case for me. Filipinos will like, it's like a cultural thing where older Filipinos will tease you, be like, do you have a boyfriend yet? Or you have a boyfriend? All this stuff. And, you know, they're like, they like to tease you. It's a very teasing culture, which sometimes can get like intense, like too much, but we like to like talk shit to each other and like be mean to each other and stuff. But as far as dating and friendships, I had like a lot of internalized misogyny stuff growing up, so I just had a lot of guy friends. And some of this I don't think was, it's interesting now to talk about it in the context of a cultural lens or whatever, but I hung out with a lot of boys and a lot of older boys when I was a kid, which is why I was always getting into trouble. It didn't really seem like, I mean, my dad wasn't really involved in my friends at all. He was very like, I guess he wouldn't really let me do a whole ton of stuff, but I kind of did all the stuff that I wanted when I was at my mom's. They were separated. So like when I was with my dad, I'd act like very straight-laced and wouldn't like hang out with any of my friends because he wouldn't let me. But then when I was with my mom, I was like running off like drinking and doing drugs with these like all these guys and stuff. But as long as like I'm specifically thinking about like the acceptance of, if my Lola accepts my friends, because my house is a total matriarch, and if she accepts it, then it's fine. And as long as my guy friends were always like respectful to her, she wouldn't have a problem. She always wanted to know my friends. She wanted to invite them over, so they had Filipino food. She's like, I want to make sure that you have good friends. And so I would basically like, if I really wanted one of my friends to impress her, I'd be like, okay, here's some traditions that you can do to be like respectful to elders. Like there's a blessing that you do when you address elders, where you take their hand and you put it on your forehead and it's like you bless them. So then I would teach them to that. Like I taught that to Brooke. I'm like, you gotta do that when you meet my Lola and she'll be impressed. And they're like, oh wow, you like, you're so respectful, you bless me and all this stuff. But then dating, yeah, like I had said earlier, it's kind of just like, do you have a boyfriend yet? It's kind of encouraged. And when you have a partner, even if you break up, they're still going to be considered family forever. I mean, unless there was something like really, really bad. And so I think that's one thing that's cool about dating and friendships in Filipino culture is like, and it's also okay, usually like, if you break up with someone, you're still okay with them being friends with your family. Like it's still, like if my dad wanted to hit up one of my exes, I wouldn't feel weird about it. I would honestly encourage it, even if I was like, I don't want to be there. But that's kind of the relationship that Filipinos have with their kids, like dating and having friends. Yes. I feel like it's very easy for Filipinos to be the butt of the joke for like East Asians or like just, you know, I mean like the politics of desirability within Asian cultures, where like East Asian is seen as good, like extremely light-skinned, and where like brown people are like Southeast Asians or South Asians are like seen as lesser Asians. The colorism is absolutely there, and that's true within our own culture, but then that's definitely true of like outsiders, how they view Filipinos. There is not a lot of visibility for indigenous African Filipinos, but there's like Negritos Islands, like that are or Negros Islands rather, where like indigenous African people have been in the Philippines since like forever ago. I think people first reached the Philippines like 39,000 years ago, where in the to contextualize that, I think the most recent for like Native Americans in like continental US was like 10,000 years ago. So 10,000 versus 39,000 is like a huge amount of time for there to be like different, you know, like migration and stuff like that to happen. But there are indigenous African Filipino people there that have been there before anyone else. So I think there's not a lot of visibility of that, and just not a lot of visibility of Black Filipino people in general. Yeah, I have a whole thing that I just realized I didn't talk about that can be a good closing thing. So because the economy of the Philippines has been devastated for like ever now, the Philippines' largest export is labor. So like some places is like beef or like a service or something. Like it could be animals, it could be animal products, it could be food products, it could be whatever. Ours is labor. So 10% of the Philippine population does not live in the Philippines because of overseas Filipino workers. And that's like within labor studies, within migration studies, OFWs, overseas Filipino workers. It's like a specific phenomenon. So a lot of our labor is exported to like, it'll be countries regionally in Southeast Asia that have more economic privilege, like going to Singapore, or a lot of people go to like the Middle East or go to Europe or go to North America, doing like domestic work. I feel like domestic work and domestic labor is probably the largest export, where it's tends to be Filipino mothers or grandmothers who have to leave their families behind because they cannot find work or cannot get enough money in the Philippines. So there's this dynamic of Filipino women being caretakers, and there's a lot of like white American families who have like Filipina nannies or whatever, live-in nannies, and they're missing the entirety of their children growing up because they're displaced workers. And that's also to be said about a lot of men are like maritime sea workers who work on the oceans for fisheries and stuff like that. That's a super common thing for overseas Filipino workers, but also women too. My last ex, he worked in a fishery in Alaska, and he was like, it was all Filipino women working 16 hours a day labor, 7 days a week, sending all of that money home. And so I'm so thankful that my grandma has like a pretty lucrative career, because you couldn't show for it, because all of the money goes home. The Philippines is the number 3 country in the world to receive remittances, like money sent home. And so I think, like I said earlier, that's really tied with money being transient, and like if you have the ability, you should be helping someone out. But it's so interesting how that plays out, because like our mothers are exported, our grandmothers are exported, and they're missing out on these entire experiences with their families, forming genuine emotional relationships with children that aren't theirs, and that labor, that invisible, specifically like Filipino women, domestic labor, is not really validated. So I think that ties a little bit back to the matriarch, like themes of the matriarch, because it's like they really are the ones that run the home. They're the ones who take care of it, and like we couldn't function without Filipino women. Like the entirety of the Filipino civilization could not have prospered or done anything without the labor, like the invisible labor of Filipino women. So I think that's a really important thing, just like in the context of like the United States, because like a lot of the Filipinos that come here, you know, nursing is a big thing for Filipinos, but also just the domestic labor. It's Chinese, Indians, and Filipinos that all are about the same amount of population in the United States, but there's not any representation of Filipino Americans at all. And so it's like, it's interesting because it's like, we're here, we're doing a lot of stuff, but we're also doing a lot of the invisible labor that a lot of a lot of Latino people are also doing, like this low skill domestic labor that is easy to be hidden. But I think a big misconception is that we're here and there's a lot of us and we're not going anywhere. So it's pretty cool.